I'll just give you a little bit of background about how the Tamiflu saga, I think it can only be called, came up. Tom contacted, I think, spoke to Channel 4 News and about the situation where they couldn't access data, lead authors could not hand over data. And then they came to us to see what we could do about it. And then what ensued was 3 months essentially of investigation where whistleblowers came forward who had ghostwritten the main RCTs, and they sent us their employment terms of contract with the company that was the ghostwriting company. We were also sent marketing material for Tamiflu from Roche. And what was interesting about that was those people who were clearly paid, or key opinion leaders who were clearly paid to market the drug, then held influential positions in policy. So we published the Tamiflu story and then followed up a few months later looking at where key opinion leaders had got to, and as it happens, they had a very influential role within WHO. And we asked WHO for their conflicts of interest statements, and they weren't forthcoming. Even though they said they'd been signed, they wouldn't produce them or couldn't produce them. And we never really were totally sure whether any conflicts of interest were signed or whether WHO ignored them. And that was all done against a backdrop of an uncertain evidence base, coupled with a total lack of transparency of decision-making at WHO. So major decisions were made behind closed doors, made by people who weren't named. And that, in essence, led conspiracy theories to ferment on the internet. And it's hardly surprising. And then that led to other investigations, another one about rosiglitazone, otherwise known as Avandia, which was later suspended from the market in Europe, and it's still on the market in the United States with severe restrictions. But what was interesting about that is it brought us into contact with people within the FDA who were analysing, doing what Tom's been doing on Tamiflu with the rosiglitazone trials, most notably what's called the record trial, which appeared in the Lancet, I think it was in 2009, don't quote me on that. But they were, Thomas Marciniak, who's from the cardiovascular division at the FDA, was digging down into the data. It was an open label trial, and he saw problems with ascertainment bias that clearly favoured the rosiglitazone arm. And he said very clearly to us, you don't get anywhere unless you dig. I'm a great believer in digging, and you really need to analyse the data. And what became apparent during that investigation was how the FDA approached data compared to how the European Medicines Agency approached data, where the FDA tried to reconstruct the study summaries, where the European Medicines Agency tend to take it at face value, which might have been one of the explanations why the European Medicines Agency seemed to support the Kaiser analysis where the FDA didn't with Tamiflu. So that was really the start of us doing full-time investigations, and we harnessed the use of national media as well. So we've done joint investigations with Channel 4 News, with Dispatches and with Panorama. And what's quite interesting about this collaboration is you have researchers that are able to synthesize evidence and ask the relevant research questions. You have the resource that national media, particularly TV media, bring, because they will invest £100,000 upwards in documentaries, which enables us to recruit other researchers. And it also allows us to ask questions that perhaps researchers can't ask for political reasons, or perhaps they don't have access. I mean, I don't know whether you're aware that all organisations have press officers. I'm sure you are aware, and they can either be a hindrance or a help. But essentially, we're able to ask questions, and the media are able to ask questions that they will feel compelled to reply to. But one investigation I'd been itching to do for a little while was on devices. I'd heard various things like, oh, it's cowboy territory. I realised in Congress, Europeans have been referred to as guinea pigs. But you looked at the media, or the European media and European journals, and very little had been written about device regulation. So really it was a case of going back to first principles and actually looking at the European legislation. And I don't know whether anyone's read European legislation. It's not an easy read. So we had to wade through swathes and swathes of documents to try and understand what actually goes on at the European level. And it was interesting and actually fairly alarming when you're coming to it afresh because I looked at the drug regulation in quite some depth, but not touched on devices. And funnily enough, the BMJ had done stuff about the FDA, about their pre-market authorization route, which does require some clinical trials compared to their 510K route or fast-track route or similar equivalents, where a company only has to say or demonstrate that one product is like another before it gains market entry. And there's been quite a lot of controversy in the United States about this 510K route. Rita Redberg, who's the editor of Archives of Internal Medicine, had presented in front of Congress because she considered that route not to be effective enough. You didn't have to demonstrate the product's effectiveness or safety on its own grounds. So we started to look into Europe. And what would you say if I said that for most high-risk devices, now medical devices include bandages and plasters, right through to pacemakers, defibrillators, hip prostheses, and so on. What would you say that for most high-risk devices, there's no clinical study or trial is needed to gain access to the market? You might have to do a few simulator tests. Or that market entry is based on an agreement between the manufacturer and a commercial private body who acts as the regulator. They're called notified bodies, and that's all done behind closed doors. Or that our national regulators, so the MHRA in the UK, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, they do not see any rationale, any of the scientific rationale or scientific data, if it exists, for market entry. Post-marketing studies are agreed between the notified body and the manufacturer, and again, there's no real regulatory oversight. And that even the regulators in Europe don't know exactly what's on the market. Now, maybe for plasters, that doesn't matter as much, but things like stents, defibrillators, pacemakers, so on and so forth, they could never provide a list of what exactly is on the market. They simply don't know. And in the United States, like I said, European patients have been referred to as guinea pigs, and advocates of patient safety have been using Europe as an example of how bad things can get. Interestingly enough, there was a story today in the New York Times about how there's lobby at the moment in the House of Representatives to become more like Europe. The medical devices industry is pushing to become more like Europe. I think they've been citing job losses as one of the reasons why. But anyway, Nick Freemantle, who, for those who don't know, is an epidemiologist at UCL, he literally said, and I will quote what he said, sorry, the current European regulatory framework, which is known as CE marking, might provide sufficient safeguards for electric toasters and kettles, but it is not adequate for treatments that can affect symptoms, health-related quality of life, serious morbidity, and mortality. Essentially, there's very little efficacy, effectiveness, or safety data. Okay, so industry say that, and I'm not being anti-industry here, but I have to kind of lump them together. I've been using the ABHI, the Association of British Healthcare Industries, as their main representative. They say that the EU light touch regulation is no worse than the US. But what's their evidence for that? The problem is there's no evidence for that because the evidence is not accessible. We have no way of knowing what percentage of high-risk devices have been recalled, are faulty, that are poorly designed, taken off the market, because like I said, there is no centrally held database or maintained register. And Jeffrey Shuren, for those, again, who don't know, is the head of device regulation in the US. He said to the BMJ, for the public in the EU, there's no transparency. The approval requirements are just what deal is cut between the device company and the private organisation. We have to kind of ask whether that's kind of good enough. So what the BMJ decided to do is we partnered with Carl Hennigan and Matthew Thompson, and we thought we'd look, because the only data we really had access to was those devices that have been recalled, because they are at least listed by the MHRA. So what we thought we'd do is we'd contact the manufacturers of all those devices that have been recalled to see what data that their market entry was based on. And the responses we got were quite interesting. To cite a few examples, is that clinical data is proprietary information, that all data, the company is confidential information, and they could only discuss publicly available information, and there's very little of that. So we thought we'd go to the CE body, the people that grant the CE mark, the notified bodies. So, for example, BSI, that's one of them. There's about 76 around Europe and Australia. And this is the responses that we got, and they were pretty stark. The information is classed as confidential because they are working as a client on behalf of the manufacturers. So these are the regulators. They consider themselves a client of the manufacturers. And so essentially, it's up to the manufacturer and any independent researchers, and you have to consider how much research is independently funded away from the company. It's up to them to put what information they want to in the public domain. And I haven't done the study, but I certainly know that a couple of case studies that I looked at, they've been on the market years and years and years before anything appeared in the scientific literature. So where do doctors get their information from? That's one of the big questions, really. So what about the Freedom of Information request? Freedom of Information Act, that enabled Tom to get at data from the European Medicines Agency. So we thought we'd try and apply the FOI, but you can't send a Freedom of Information request to a private body. So we couldn't send a Freedom of Information request to the manufacturers. We couldn't send one to the notified bodies because they're exempt from any legislation. So what we thought we'd do is see what we could get out the MHRA. But obviously, they're only listing any devices that have been recalled, but they do have an adverse reaction service where clinicians can email up or patients can email up and mention any adverse effects of a device. We know reporting rates are pretty low on the whole. Anyway, we thought we'd see if we could get at any of that data. And we asked for specific examples because we wanted the data from those that have been recalled. And that was thwarted because I will quote what the device legislation says. So Article 15 of the EU Medical Devices Directive states, Member States shall ensure that all parties involved in the application of this directive are bound to observe confidentiality with regard to all information obtained in carrying out their tasks. So for example, we asked for the data for the ASR, and this was a hip prosthesis that was made by a company called Depew that had been taken off the market because it had been failing so badly in releasing chromium and cobalt ions into the blood. We were turned down on that request, even though it had been taken off the market. And what's interesting, though, as well, even though there's quite a powerful lobby, it's what the Association of British Healthcare Industries actually say about the lack of transparency themselves. And this is what they told the BMJ. To date, it's very hard for anyone, even manufacturers and authorities, let alone citizens, to find out what products are approved to be on the market. We would like to see enhanced transparency and information to patients, citizens, and all EU government authorities. So essentially, they say there's not enough transparency. And there are discussions going on at the European level, but one of the problems facing the discussions is that Europe has a lack of money, as I'm sure you're all aware. There have been talks about having an agency that's similar to the FDA or the European Medicines Agency, but for that you need money, and money simply isn't available. To give you a sense of the lack of perhaps data or expectation of data, there was an interesting rapid response that was posted up to the BMJ after we'd published the package on devices, and this went out with Channel 4 dispatches at the same time. And this was from a correspondence from the Difficult Airway Society. And they said, the specialty of anaesthesia has for several years faced serious problems with the arrival of clinically untested devices, especially those designed to manage the patient's airway. Trusts are not unreasonably attracted by low-cost devices, and where few devices lack supporting evidence, it is difficult to support an alternative to the cheapest. The Difficult Airway Society is the largest specialty organisation in anaesthetics, consisting of some 3,000 members, and recently resolved to issue guidance to its members, some of whom sit on hospital trust procurement committees. Our guidance now advises members to recommend purchase of only those products that are supported by at least a minimum level of clinical evidence, i.e. at least one published case control clinical trial. In other words, we are exploiting the fact that while the Medical Devices Directive can dictate what can be legitimately sold on the market, it cannot dictate what should be purchased. As clinicians, we are entitled to purchase devices based on any criteria we like, and as a specialist society, have now formally resolved to recommend purchasing decisions based on evidence. This is 2011, purchasing decisions based on evidence. And interestingly enough, another quote from a very senior orthopaedic surgeon in Australia said, "We're now starting to ask for 2 years' worth of data before we start putting prostheses into patients." Like it was really, that was a real step forward. Although the minimum level of evidence we initially suggest in our guidance falls considerably short of what we would consider ideal, we know that it will automatically exclude the majority of devices relevant to our practice, which are brought onto the market lacking any clinical evidence. This step itself will place considerable pressure on industry to support and/or publish results from high-quality clinical trials before marketing. So I think that kind of pretty much sums up where we are with devices, and if there are concerns over regulation and trials concerning drugs, devices is a whole world behind. And I won't go into detail here, but clinicians are dependent on what journals tell them as well as what the manufacturers tell them. And I have all sorts of interesting stories currently under investigation about the kind of decisions that are made editorially on some specialist journals. So I think that pretty much says where we are.
Peter McCulloch from Oxford, from the Patient Safety Research Unit there. I only became aware of the situation regarding regulation of devices partly through my interest in IDEAL, but partly through reading your work. And I just want to know how we got here, the history of how these notified bodies came into existence and how such an obviously not fit for purpose system was set up. There must have been some rationale at some point for how this happened, but I can't understand it.
I wish I had the answer. All I know is that, the reasons I was given was drug regulation really started with thalidomide, and it really took a scandal on that size to get any kind of drug regulation in place. And the medical device legislation really started in earnest in the 1990s. Before that, there was next to nothing. But what has amazed me and when you do any kind of research, and it's exactly the same for you guys, the processes of journalism, you automatically look back at what's previously been published, whether that's newspaper cuttings, whether that's in the academic literature, and there was pretty much nothing. And that's why we were having to go right back to our starting place was huge directives and reading through those. And actually, someone very senior in the FDA said to me, when I spoke to him, he said, "I can't believe the European press has been so silent on this issue. If it's in the United States, we'd have the New York Times onto us, we'd have ProPublica, we'd have the Washington Post, and so on and so forth. But there's been so little scrutiny, and I actually not sure why, I don't know. I suppose the answer is."
Thanks. Can I just ask Peter again? So I just wanted to get the microphone back to Peter McCulloch. Peter, could you just talk briefly about the IDEAL initiative? One of the things that I think is very interesting is about how surgery iterates, how surgeons improve on devices. And some of the work that Deb did was about, hip surgeons becoming inventors and therefore having a vested interest in their particular device, and how surgery advances and how we manage to deal with that conflict of interest.
Well, sure. I think IDEAL is about the process that surgery and similar specialties have to go through to develop new innovations. And there has to be a tinkering process at the beginning of new operations and with new devices. And obviously there are issues around conflict of interest at that level, but there's also a huge issue of transparency. The way that we traditionally publish our information is pretty useless in terms of helping people understand what's going on, because we tend to save up our experience until we feel it's good enough to publish and smooth over all the difficulties that took place in the early innovation stage. So we're going to a conference with the FDA in December at which devices are going to be the specific topic. And I'm obviously very keen to learn as much as I can from you and others about what we'll be facing there. I've read Jeff Shuren's criticism of the European system. Obviously, the American system isn't perfect either. But I'm just a bit bemused as to how we got here.
So,
I think there's a couple of things. And one of the arguments has been, and what I've seen very much coming from, again, it was in the New York Times today from industry, is that patients have access to these amazing, innovative products before we do, and that's the pressure that is being applied. There's the job argument, which obviously carries currency in times of economic austerity. But the other argument is, we're losing patients to Europe, they're going to Europe to have this innovative procedure done. And I think you have to ask legitimately, how many things on the market are truly, truly innovative? I mean, certainly I can talk a bit more about hip prostheses, for example. I mean, there was over 1,000 different combinations of hip prosthesis on the market, all sorts of different combinations. And I don't understand what the argument is. You need several years follow-up testing before it's allowed onto the market. I don't think that argument stands in that. And certainly, probably you could use similar arguments with stents and so on and so forth. But that's the argument that is put forward in the States.
I wouldn't like to call it regulation. Let's say the legislation, the rulings on devices in Europe up to recently were under the care of DG Enterprise, European Commission. I think that answers your question, because the main focus was, of course, on enterprise. Nothing to do with inserting intraocular lenses without testing them even on a cat, probably.
okay.
The whole package went, and one other quick point, the whole package, so the European Medicines Agency shifted from enterprise, and devices shifted from DG Enterprise to DG Sanco, which is the public health at the European level. It was February last year. But even in the discussions, and what I've been told at the European level, there is one clinician, and actually he's Alan Fraser at Cardiff, he's a interventional cardiologist. There is one clinician that is represented at the European level. The rest are representatives, politicians, civil servants and industry in these discussions.
But how the devices are actually introduced in the market is a fairly worn path. They're introduced, shown to clinicians at high-level exotic events. And you know that better than I do. You go into the American Society of Radiological Medicine, and it's like a supermarket. You go in there, there's a massive amount of displays and stuff like that, and it's all hard sell, and they can do it even in America.
Yeah, Jeremy Howick from the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford. I personally witnessed the lack of regulation. I was invited to a meeting in August, and they've still been trying to make me sign a paper that recommends that new 100 million pound proton therapy machines should not be tested rigorously. And what I want to know is, you've done all this research. Have you quantified at all the harm that's been done by lack of regulation?
We couldn't, because we couldn't even get something basic like a denominator, so the number of devices on the market. I mean, that was the challenge. There was just so little information out there, thwarted by medical device legislation that says everything's pretty much commercial in confidence, so you can't even access the freedom of information. And just even the regulators don't have. And we asked the MHRA, I have it in writing, the MHRA specifically, do you have a list of all class 3, so that's the highest risk devices that are being used in the UK? No. And that's compounded by the fact that not all surgical procedures are well coded. So, you know, I can go and get prescription data really easily, but I can't go and find out, you know, what devices are being used where. Now, something that's increasingly being used are registries. And again, in orthopedics, they have the National Joint Registry, and that's being very much relied upon by the regulators. So what that does, it's quite a blunt instrument, so it measures revision rate. This hip's gone wrong, it's been replaced or taken out, and that's what it measures to see how well an implant does. But there's a problem with that. First of all, there's the time lag, so if something's doing really badly, it takes a while for the registry to catch up. But also, and this is what's happening at the moment, and it happened with the ASR, which was one of the implants that was taken out the market, is sometimes the pathology is silent. So the symptoms are very non-specific. So you have to rely on a clinician to pick up the problems in the first place, make a clinical decision before it even gets to the registry. And what we've seen are surgeons that are seeing problems that haven't been picked up by the registry, but they've got nowhere to go with those problems, because I have to say that the regulators don't seem to be quite dependent on the registries and happy sometimes to take a back step, I have to say.
I've been involved in a health technology assessment on percutaneous aortic valves in 2008. At that very moment, almost 10,000 of these devices had been implanted all over the world, except for the United States. We found there was no single randomized controlled trial. There were only registries, undefined, not well described within the safes of the manufacturers. There were only registers, never published, only presented at the big conferences you were talking about. And we saw that on average, these devices are used in very sick patients with a life expectancy of a few years. We saw that the 30-day mortality following the intervention was on average 10%. 1 out of 10 patients died within 30 days. We have never understood, but maybe you can tell us, but I think you told already the answer. We could not understand that these devices already in the year 2007 received a CE marking. There was no serious trial. There were lots of registries indicating the poor performance, the high risk, the harm, the safety to these patients. I've never understood how an agency, how Europe could accept this practice.
And I'm sure there's lots and lots and lots of different, and you know, I felt very much that we'd scratched the surface of this. I mean, I was leaked things by certain individuals, obviously I can't say, about things that hadn't made it onto the market in America because they'd asked for pre-market authorization, they'd asked for trials that hadn't got onto the market in America that were being widely used in Europe. Peter Wilmshurst can give chapter and verse about that in some about the mistrial to close patent for Monavali. But it's very hard. The FDA asked for the data. We put it up on Dryad, so the data was available, and the FDA asked for the data. But it's very hard to compare the two systems when there's such opacity in Europe.
Our conclusion was that in Europe, people do experiments in pigs and sheep, and United States investigators, they do experiments on Europeans.
Well, that's it. And that's Nick Fremantle actually said that he was involved in a trial of a device that was already on the market in Europe, but he was involved in a trial to put it on the American market. So
we've got time for one last question.
Daphne Austin, consultant in public health, and I've been a commissioner for 20 years, and commissioners and public health community feel totally thwarted in this area. I cannot understand how an industry can come to a tax-funded system, say, can I have £100 million for this drug or this device, and we don't demand good evidence, we don't demand open access to the data. And I think that, you know, it relates to an earlier session around we can actually change the behaviours by changing our response. But every time the commissioners sort of have demanded this in the past, and many others, it's not just the commissioners, we get thwarted. And I just feel I don't quite understand why we don't respond, and if our politicians won't do it, and whatever other shenanigans are going on, and there's an awful lot of it, I think the NHS can still respond, if you see what I mean, but it's just not happening. And I've seen it for 20 years, and all of us have seen it for, you know, forever.
I mean, I feel quite strongly that doctors have a role to play here, and they should demand the data before they start, and evidence before they start switching their products. And you know, and unfortunately, when I was doing one piece of work, again, it was on the ASR, it was a case of history repeating itself. And the BMJ had an editorial in 1993 by Chris Bulstrode warning about designer hips. And it happened again, and it's happened again. And I think doctors have to take their share of responsibility in this as well.